Philosophers seriously discuss the possibility that the universe is some kind of simulation, and in one version of that scenario, our creator is a computer programmer from a very advanced extraterrestrial, or rather extra-universal, civilization. And certainly, if the human predicament is the creation of an adolescent hacker, that would explain a lot. But we have no reason to assume as much, and there is precedent in theology for using the word God in a non-anthropomorphic way. For example, the 20th century Christian theologian Paul Tillich described God as the ground of being. As critics of Tillich have pointed out, the ground of being sounds a bit vague, maybe too vague to qualify as a god. In fact, it sounds a lot like the ultimate reality invoked by some Eastern mystics who consider themselves atheists. What good does a god this abstract do for traditional believers who envision a superhuman anthropomorphic God, a personal God that they can talk to and thank and love and apologize to? In what sense could their belief in a personal God be vindicated by the existence of a more abstract God? Vindication lies in the eyes of the beholder. But one plausible ground for vindication would be if it turned out that a personal God, as commonly conceived, is a reasonable approximation of the more abstract God, given the constraints on human conception. Suppose, for example, that we accept as our abstract conception of God the source of the moral order. Tillich's equally abstract ground of being is something I'm not qualified to articulate, much less defend. I brought it up only as an example of theological abstraction. Could it be that thinking of this source and relating to this source as if it were a personal God is actually an appropriate way for human beings to apprehend that source, even if more appropriate ways might be available to beings less limited in their capacity for apprehension? This sounds fishy, I know. It sounds like a strained, even desperate intellectual maneuver, a last-ditch attempt to rescue a pre-scientific conception of God from the onslaught of modern science. But, oddly, an argument that it's not comes from modern science. Physicists commonly do something that is in some ways analogous to believing in a personal God. The ultimate reality of science. It's a bedrock idea of modern physics that, even if you define ultimate reality as the ultimate scientific reality, the most fundamental truths of physics, ultimate reality isn't something you can clearly conceive. Think of an electron, a little particle that spins around another little particle. Wrong. True. Physicists sometimes find it useful to think of electrons as particles, but sometimes it's more useful to think of them as waves. Conceiving of them as either is incomplete, yet conceiving of them as both is, well, inconceivable. Try it. And electrons are just the tip of the iceberg. In general, the quantum world, the world of subatomic reality, behaves in ways that don't make sense to minds like ours. Various aspects of quantum physics evince the property that the late physicist Heinz Pagels called quantum weirdness. The bad news for the religiously inclined, then, is that maybe they should abandon hope of figuring out what God is. If we can't conceive of an electron accurately, what are our chances of getting God right? The good news is that the hopelessness of figuring out exactly what something is doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Apparently some things are just inconceivable, and yet are things nonetheless. At least some physicists believe electrons are things. The fact that nobody's actually seen an electron, and that trying to imagine one ties our minds in knots, has led some physicists and philosophers of science to wonder whether it's even accurate to say that electrons do exist. You could say that with electrons, as with God, there are believers and there are skeptics. The believers believe there's something out there, some thing in some sense of the word thing, that corresponds to the word electron, and that, though the best we can do is conceive of this thing imperfectly, even misleadingly, conceiving of it that way makes more sense than not conceiving of it at all. They believe in electrons while professing their inability to really know what an electron is. You might say they believe in electrons even while lacking proof that electrons per se exist. Many of these physicists, while holding that imperfectly conceiving subatomic reality is a valid form of cognition, wouldn't approve if you tried to perform a similar maneuver in a theological context. If you said you believe in God, even while acknowledging that you have no clear idea what God is, and that you can't even really prove God per se exists, they would say your belief has no foundation. Yet, what exactly is the difference between the logic of their belief in electrons and the logic of a belief in God? They perceive patterns in the physical world, such as the behavior of electricity, and posit a source of these patterns and call that source the electron. A believer in God perceives patterns in the moral world, or at least moral patterns in the physical world, and posits a source of these patterns and calls the source God. God is that unknown thing that is the source of the moral order, the reason there is a moral dimension to life on earth and a moral direction to time on earth. God is responsible for the fact that life is sentient, capable of good and bad feelings, and hence morally significant. God is responsible for the evolutionary system that places highly sentient life on a trajectory toward the good, or at least toward tests that offer the opportunity and incentive to realize the good. In the process, God gave each of us a moral axis around which to organize our lives, should we choose to. Being human, we will always conceive of the source of this moral order in misleadingly crude ways. But then again, you could say the same thing about conceiving electrons. So you'll do with the source of the moral order what physicists do with the subatomic source of the physical order, such as an electron. Try to think about it the best you can, and fail. This, at least, is one modern, scientifically informed argument that could be deployed by the believer in God. The atheist strikes back. There are plausible rejoinders that an atheist scientist who believes in electrons could make, because there are places where the analogy between God and an electron breaks down. In particular, the scientist could say, but something like an electron is necessary to explain patterns we see in the physical world. In contrast, something like God isn't necessary to explain the moral order of the universe. It's a good point. This book's account of the moral direction of history has been a materialist account. We've explained the expansion of the moral imagination as an outgrowth of expanding social organization, which is itself an outgrowth of technological evolution, which itself grows naturally out of the human brain, which itself grew naturally out of the primordial ooze via evolution. There's no mystical force that has to enter the system to explain this, and there's no need to look for one. Indeed, when the religious believer talks about the source of the moral order, the scientist could reply that the source of the moral order is the electron, or, strictly speaking, other subatomic particles that are more fundamental than the electron. After all, the primordial ooze ultimately consists of subatomic particles. If the expansion of the moral imagination can be explained in materialist terms, then its deepest explanation is the deepest explanation for the material world in general, the grand, unified theory that physicists have been looking for. So why start talking about God?